The very existence of Soul Hackers 2 has been an unexpected but very welcome surprise. After reviewing the first game just over a year and a half ago, I came away feeling mostly positive about the experience. I absolutely loved the general vibes of the game's characters and setting, but I also felt a little bit disappointed at just how underutilized a lot of it felt, with various characters contributing very little to the overall narrative, as well as the game only providing a very small lens into the world of the Devil Summoner subseries, resulting in a game that, while very near and dear to me, feels like it had a lot of wasted potential. And while the Rido games did continue the Devil Summoner series and fleshed out that world much more, the 1930s detective vibe is a very different one to the shady underground gang wars of the first two games. With this in mind, I had one real hope for Soul Hackers 2, and that's whether or not it could properly showcase that world the original wasn't quite able to, whilst also having a full cast of characters that properly impact the story. Welcome back to another episode of Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei game, everyone. A series where I play through my Atlus backlog, both new and old, with a title that still gives me grief with people who like splitting hairs to this day. Soul Hackers 2, I feel, marks the beginning of a new era for Atlus, or rather a return to an old one. For pretty much the whole PS3 and PS4 era, Atlus were kind of stuck in a weird precarious situation where even if just one big release flopped, they'd be in serious danger of going under. And this is what led to things like them not being able to publish SMT4 in Europe for the longest time despite it already being translated, as well as them making multiple re-releases or smaller scoped games for the 3DS and milking Persona 4 for what it was worth with as many spin-offs as possible. And it's what ultimately led them to being bought up by Sega. But now we're finally moving back into an age where Atlus feels confident enough to release weird little spin-off titles that might not necessarily be as big or bombastic as a Persona or a mainline SMT title, but it's still able to keep fans of the franchise from having to wait half a decade between titles. With that all being said though, this does also mean that they'll be coming with smaller budgets, meaning less bells, less whistles, less flashing lights, and fancy set pieces are going to be present within the game to really wow the average player, especially one who's expecting it to be a lot more like one of its sister series. How Soul Hackers 2 differs from its fellow sub-series within the Mega 10 franchise is with its story, or more importantly, it's how it presents said story. I explained a little bit in my SMT5 review how each branch of the Mega 10 IP presents itself in a slightly different way. Mainline, for example, focuses heavily on theming a message above all else, sometimes in detriment to itself in SMT5's case. Persona, on the other hand, tends to focus more on its characters, with its social link system and dungeons and powers being manifestations of the characters' personalities and sense of self. The Devil Summoner series, on the other hand, has a much bigger focus on its world, with Soul Hackers 2 probably sitting around about here. It still has that same kind of feel and vibe as the other games in its sub-series, but with a small, tight-knit cast that tells a very intimate story amongst them, we definitely get a really good focus on the story's characters as well. And I'll tell you now, the cast of Soul Hackers 2 are some of my favourites from Mega 10 to date. Starting with Ringo, our protagonist, she first of all gets 100 points just for not being a silent self-insert for once. Huge applause to you there, Atlus. Ringo and her partner, as well as the team's navigator Fig, are both agents of Ion, an unimaginably large sentient thought entity spawned from the huge amounts of data being carried around by mankind's technology all the time. Essentially, it's a godlike being created from the amino acids of the internet. With its incredible processing power, Aeon is able to predict that the end of the world is very close by, and as it wishes to continue to exist, can no longer stay as just an observer of mankind. But without any physical form, the only way for it to interfere whilst remaining hidden is to create two near-human beings, and cramming putting as much of the vast hive mind into their bodies as physically possible, whilst also granting them preset personalities. Think either Nagato Yuki from Haruhi Suzumiya or Legion from Mass Effect. When I first realized that Ringo was basically a robot from the trailers, I was a little bit worried, as the robot girl AI trope is something Atlus have been kinda using a little bit too often. And while I'm personally very fond of it, it is something that I can see people burning out on at this point. Luckily, since Ringo and Fig do have those pre-built personalities and they basically have the internet living in their brains, it means that while they're definitely trying to get to grips with how humans behave and work, they're not the typical fish out of water situation which we've had so many times before. Ringo is optimistic, smug, and very reckless at times, but all in all is kind of a dork at her core.
How many people could this feed?
I don't know. I just thought it'd be cool to dramatically reveal a load of pizza.
Her desire to make use of her new human sense of self and to try out and learn as much about human nature and lifestyles results in a very endearing main character, with her spunky personality also helping her really fit into that leadership role really well. Throughout the game, I couldn't help but find her really endearing and always cheered for her every time she did something stupid but also calculated at the same time. Despite many obvious differences, she has a lot of the same strengths as one of my other favourite female protagonists, Estelle from Trails in the Sky, and trust me, from me that is a glowing recommendation. Fig, on the other hand, has a much more reserved and deliberate way of approaching her mission, taking a step back to play as navigator, as well as occasionally struggling with the idea of becoming more like a human, as she feels like at times she's prioritizing other things, such as looking after a group of kids from the orphanage over her mission. She's a great blue to Ringo's red Oni, and the two of them both contrast but also match each other really well, allowing us to see two very different perspectives from the same point of view. The other three major players in the story are three different devil summoners who all belong to a different faction, whose deaths directly lead to the end of the world occurring. Something that Ringo and Fig are not able to prevent, but attempt to undo via some reckless use of soul hacking, a trick that Ringo uses to bring them all back to life. These characters being Arrow, a dedicated, albeit bit simple-minded member of the organization Yatagarasu, a group of devil summoners sworn to protect Japan that fans of the Raido game should be all too familiar with. Melody, a high-ranking assassin who, on a quest for revenge, has turned against the Phantom Society, a group that wishes to destroy the world with the goal of rebuilding it anew. And finally Saizo, a seemingly devil-may-care freelance summoner who, after playing both sides, has finally had his luck catch up to him. Even though there's no alignment system in this game, it's still very clear where these three lie on the old SMT chart. Even their elemental affinities match up. Between Ringo and the three of them, we develop a really small but strong and intimate cast of characters, all working together towards a common goal while having their bonds between them grow, despite having various clashing ideals. And I'm pretty sure that's just good JRPG Party 101 right there. They're a really fun cast of characters that have a lot of genuinely good chemistry amongst each other, but there's also just that little bit of friction there that really does a lot to add to the dynamic. What I really appreciate about the game's narrative though is that with an older cast compared to your average JRPG, as well as your average SMT or Persona, means that the general feel to the narrative is a lot more jaded and cynical than what you'd normally get. But not in an immature, nihilistic way that I think is a very easy trapping for a game like this to fall into. Soul Hackers 2 is a story of the cycle of violence and dismay, but also of the stagnation of that cycle, as well as the society it's part of slowly dying. The cast of characters are not particularly old, but they have lived in the world long enough to know that change is not something so easily done, and that they can't really leave any substantial impact by themselves. But with Ringo both being this hopeful young bright spark, even if she doesn't necessarily feel like one, as well as being this new variable on the situation, it means she's able to give them this newfound branch of hope to truly help them on whichever path they might take to achieve this new change. That's enough about the story for now, but I do want to come back to it later on in the video. As you'd probably expect at this point, Soul Hackers 2 very much has the stylings of pretty much every Megaten RPG that's released since Nocturne. Unlike mainline SMT in the original Soul Hackers, however, you don't just summon your demons as party members. Due to Ringo's soul hacking linking the party's minds and souls to her, as well as the unorthodox comp that she uses, the party are unable to summon their demons like average devil summoners, and instead have to infuse them into their weapons to cast magic themselves. It feels like a little bit of a cross between each party member having the wildcard ability from the Persona series, but also feels a little bit more like the sub-Persona system from the Persona Q games, albeit a little bit more fleshed out as your character builds rely a lot more heavily on it. It's a system that works really well and is very flexible in deciding on what character builds you want to do, but then when applied with the game's other mechanics that we'll be talking about next, it really allows for each character in the party to establish their own role and niche within it, and that's just something you'll naturally start building around. The main new core weakness exploiting mechanic that Atlus love doing is the new stack and Sabbath system. Whenever one of your party members inflicts damage using an enemy's weakness, it will add 1 point to the stack, and a silhouette of the demon that you're currently using will start floating around in the background. And then at the end of the turn, every single demon that you have stacked up will be summoned to rush the enemy. This starts out pretty simple at first, as it's kind of just a weaker but more commonly activated all-out attack. But throughout the game, you will acquire new ways to gain more stacks, such as things like when Arrow is able to kill a demon, or if Melody is able to inflict a status ailment, as well as things like critical hits as well. And all of these conditions that give you stacks, well, they stack, meaning that in optimal situations you could get stack counts that can go as high as 15 in the late game, resulting in some seriously high damage. Also, with the use of certain demon-acquired abilities, it starts to become a mechanic that's more than just a simple damage payoff at the end of each turn, as these Sabbath skills will have a random but fairly likely chance of activating after any Sabbath that the demon is part of, and each one will result in some sort of bonus effect, such as reducing the enemy's defense or casting Tetrakarn on the party. What I like about this mechanic is that it even allows stuff like your fusion fodder demons that you don't necessarily use to actually be useful to you in battle, especially when you're someone like me who doesn't frugally switch around demons mid-battle. The whole Sabbath stack system is a very easy mechanic to use and is honestly a little bit simple in some situations, but what I really like about it is due to the parameters of battle always changing with enemies' affinities, getting ridiculously high stacks every turn isn't necessarily something you'll be able to do. At the very least, it requires active participation from the player to actually exploit it. Even in boss fights, many of them will change their affinities per turn or will have some sort of protection put up. So because of that, you can't exactly create a party that is solely dedicated on doing one type of elemental damage to ease your way through a boss fight. And with Sabbath damage being fairly low at low stack counts, it means that it becomes more of a bonus attack than a instant win button like the all-out attack from Persona. And while overall it's a system that definitely favours the player, it's not anywhere near as bad as something like the Magatsuhi meter in SMT5, where as long as you could survive, a guaranteed turn of critical hits would come along and just melt the boss's HP for you. Although, speaking of the Magatsuhi meter, we also have a far less broken equivalent here in the form of commander skills, although they do kind of remind me a lot more of the navigator skills from the Persona Q games too. These come in two different forms, one being auto-passives, such as randomly giving the party regen or randomly extending your party's buffs for a turn. These being really useful support abilities that you can use without expending somebody's actions, but you can only use one per turn. This is how you'll be switching out demons mid-battle, but it also allows you to do things such as giving a party member the ability to move twice in one turn, or to concentrate all of your damage of a Sabbath attack onto a single enemy instead of the entire group. Just like my main gripe with the Magatsuhi meter, there is an ability that will give you guaranteed stacks each time you deal damage for the turn. However, between the stacks being notably weaker than getting a critical in a mainline SMT, and the fact that each commander skill has its own individual cooldown timer, means that the ability never feels too OP, nor does it really impede on any potential other skills that you might want to be using. Finally, there is this minor change to the game's combat that I really enjoy, and that is the introduction of the new ruin element. SMT and Persona in general has made me grow more accustomed to using buffs and debuffs for more than just boss fights in a JRPG. But something I still barely ever use in RPGs is status ailments, unless it's something really broken like poison that gets stronger after each turn. What can I say, I have the brain of a caveman. If I don't see big damage number, how is brain meant to make good chemical? Luckily, that's where the ruin element steps in, since in Soul Hackers 2, all ailment spells actually deal ruin-based elemental damage when inflicting the enemy. The only catch being that these spells cost quite a bit of MP since they're basically 2 spells in one, but they also don't have any tier 2 or free variants of these spells available, so you won't be casting anything like Dorminodyne. This does mean that in the later game, they do start to drop off a little bit as their damage becomes kinda negligible, but what's neat is that it means the game kind of tricks you into using the entirety of the more limited pool of moves in the early game, so then you'll come up with more tactics than just hit the enemy with the move that does the biggest number. And by the time you get into the late game, you'll kind of realize how useful these ailments are, even if they're not doing quite as much damage as the actual attack moves. Or if you do move back to just using sheer damage attacks, you'll at the very least have used different tactics throughout the early and late game, making it a bit less repetitive as you go through. All of these mechanics wouldn't mean too much if it weren't for the various character building opportunities that exist though. Soul Hackers 2 is like a dopamine goldmine when it comes to upgrading your party. There's your standard fare like armor, as well as accessories in the form of mystiques that give you stuff like bonus damage and cut MP costs of your magic based skills, which can be acquired after a demon learns all of its skills, or bought and sold with a unique currency called Mr. Quartz. But there's also stuff like the Compsmith, who, by spending some money along with some crafting items, you're able to progressively upgrade your character's general damage output, as well as give them various passive upgrades to each character, like Ringo having the ability to pierce with physical skills, or giving Saizo the ability to have the chance of inflicting the feint status with his default attack. One aspect of this system that I was a little bit disappointed in is that Melody gains a unique skill via this system called Piercer, which is essentially just an almighty version of her default attack that can't crit. Although, unlike her normal attack, its damage can be boosted via an almighty augment mystique. Because of this, I was kind of under the impression that every character would be learning various unique but non-demon based skills that only they had. But alas, Melody's Piercer is the only example of a move like this. Luckily, the passives of each character do still do an adequate job of distinguishing each party member's role, but it's not quite what I was hoping for. Finally, there is the Summoner skills, which you will unlock as you go through the Soul Matrix, a set of optional dungeons which are physical manifestations of each party member's psyche, which unlocks more and more as your soul level, i.e. your bonding points with each of them, increases. At certain milestones, usually after some sort of a mini-boss, you'll be granted a new summoner skill, which are another set of passives that you can unlock that don't only help you in combat, but also out in the field too. While these are useful, the real benefit of learning new summoner skills is this is how you increase the number of ways you can gain stacks. So even though this is an optional area and mechanic, it's very much something that you'll want to invest some time into. Couple all of these things with the standard Mega 10 Demon Fusion, and you'll not only have a system with a ton of varying build potential, but also one that is practically a constant stream of dopamine coming in from various sources. Be it acquiring new demons, leveling up, getting new gear, or getting new upgrades to your comp or summoner, you'll always be upgrading your party in some sort of a substantial way. What I appreciate about this system is that in the early game it is very much balanced towards letting you explore as much as possible, and then in the mid-game onwards, each party member really starts to become more specialized and focused in a specific role, with Saizo focusing on wind and healing skills, for example. And then you encounter a new dilemma. Do you optimize on every single character's speciality so you get the highest amount of damage and the highest stack counts as possible? Or do you give them a wider spread of skills, meaning that they can consistently cash out on Sabbaths every turn, even if the overall damage output or stack count is lower? By the final act of the game, it does kind of feel like everyone should be fully optimized to each area that they're good at, which is kind of a shame because it does mean that they're kind of railroaded into specific builds. But ultimately, I think that the fact that I had multiple moments leading up to that point where I thought to myself, damn, Arrow could really do with a Zeo skill right now, he's not doing an awful lot in this fight, or something to that nature, really speaks volumes at just how well this system allows for player expression. Now, I mentioned bonding points, and I imagine this is where some of your ears might have procked up. Whether it's an interest or grievance at the idea that Soul Hackers 2 is just like Persona. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not. Not exactly, and that's a good thing. First of all, there is no romancing in this game. I don't care how cool, handsome and charming Saizo is, that man ain't simping for anything other than his goth girl GF, and that is why we stand this king. The bonding points are accumulated via two main methods. One being random dialogue choices throughout the main story, which will give you a little "Milady will remember that" message each time you pick one. And the other one being when you decide to crack open a few cold ones with the boys. These events are less like social link style cutscenes, and they're a little closer to something like the skits from the Tales of series, if not quite as out there as some of those can get. As I mentioned before, accumulating these points will allow you to advance further in each character's individual soul matrices, as they now trust Ringo more. These dungeons are incredibly dry, and while they're not randomly generated, they're obviously created out of a very simple asset set, being made up nearly entirely of just flat pathways, stairs, 90-degree turns, and two types of teleporters. They're honestly the least inspiring dungeons in the whole game, and that is really saying something, as you can probably tell from the footage. The other dungeons aren't really that much better from either a visual or a design standpoint, and only really start to get a little bit interesting when you get to the last couple. Down here in the soul matrices is where we have the kind of lazily named vision quests. In Soul Hackers 1, a vision quest was a small story vignette where the protagonist was able to experience the last few hours of a dead summoner's life, which would give them some sort of vital piece of information to help them on their quest. There were these very short but sweet sections where you got given a preset party and had a very curated and deliberate dungeon experience, and it would do wonders for building the lore and world as you got small snippets of these different people within the Phantom Society. In Soul Hackers 2, however, they're simply just these small cutscenes where Ringo and your party member receive some sort of a recreation of one of their past core memories. These are not bad scenes, and they let each character have a number of heart-to-heart conversations with Ringo and the player, fleshing out their individual arcs a bit more and really helping you learn their motives and drives. And honestly, the final one for each party member is great, but it is unfortunate that the original's most unique storytelling aspect is gone in all but name. That being said, even if these one-off character vignettes are gone, that just means that there's more time to focus on these 4 special lads and lasses, and that's pretty dope. I've used the word intimate a number of times to describe both Soul Hackers 1 and 2, and I think that, at least for me, that's part of the core appeal to both of these games. The only difference being that while Soul Hackers 1 failed to deliver when it came to giving the spookies some room to shine, Soul Hackers 2 doesn't. Ringo, Arrow, Milady, Saizo, and Fig are not necessarily the most well-written or interesting characters ever made, nor are they the most exciting or complex. What they are, however, is incredibly genuine, between their personal baggage and their growing trust in each other throughout the game, and just their chats about the mundane things in their lives. They all feel more like actual people rather than characters, which is a feeling that I think many stories in general struggle with, let alone JRPGs. That's not to say the cast don't have their own exaggerated character traits, be it in the moment of comedy or the fact that this is an anime story with the end of the world at stake. Yeah, there's gonna be some stuff like a revenge murder quest and a robot being born from the internet that's not gonna be the most relatable. But at the core of these characters, underneath all that anime, are some simple but very authentic goals. Be it wishing to protect those things that you value most, remembering those ideals and feelings that you've forgotten in age, moving on from a loss, or moving forward towards an unknown future. These things all being aspects to each character that really gives them all some proper substance. Top this all off with an impeccable voice cast and some great directing, and it really makes them all fit into that sort of simple story, detailed characters mantra. It's a writing style that I think is definitely not for everyone. It's not exactly exciting or outlandish as some of Atlus's other works, and the reason for it being done this way is almost certainly due to the game's budget restraints suiting quiet chats in a bar more than heartfelt speeches on some sort of supernatural battleground. But limitation breeds innovation, and if neon noir cyberpunk is what we get out of it, I'm certainly not complaining. That is to say, I'm not complaining about the writing style. However, it would have been nice to see this sub-series get a little bit more money in a few places. While I really like the story and its writing, the pacing, particularly right at the beginning, is a little bit off. The game starts galloping right out the gate with a brief but sizable chunk of exposition, and then within 90 minutes to 2 hours, you've already assembled your full team and you're good to go. After that though, the game kind of feels like it's giving the impression that each dungeon will resolve most of each character's arc one by one, as after the first non-opening dungeon, the main antagonistic force in Arrow's story arc has kind of been dealt with, and we just start moving right on to Saizo's next. Luckily, after that, Arrow does end up getting more going on with his character as he gains new problems to focus on, and Saizo's problems are not solved quite as quickly as Arrow's initial ones are. But this doesn't change the fact that when you're playing the game for the first time, this opening act after the introductory period is really stop-starty, and it does feel like certain characters could have had some more screen time to actually make them feel a little bit more significant. I've already talked about the bland dungeon design, and they really are pretty rough, but I do want to add, as bad and dry and flat as they are, they sit somewhere above the procedural dungeons of Persona 3 and 4, and somewhere below the nearly equally dry but relatively more interesting dungeons of Nocturne. And I feel pretty confident in saying that any fan of Atlus's games has very likely played Persona 3 or 4. And if you can handle 90 to 120 hours of something like Tartarus, I think you'll probably be fine with 30 to 60 hours of what Soul Hackers 2 has to offer. Another area of the game that I think really could have used with a budget that was more than 3 pennies in a ball of lint would be the side quests. It's honestly quite funny, as the original Soul Hackers had various hidden dungeons locked behind incredibly asinine game flags, like talking to a random NPC whose dialogue changes after one story cutscene, but will change again before the next story cutscene that can literally take place like 5 seconds later. Soul Hackers 2 on the other hand has 2 types of side quests, both of which are very difficult to miss. Ion directives are side quests exclusive to the Soul Matrix, and each floor for each character will have an MMO style gather all the collectibles, kill 6 of a specific enemy type, and fight this mini-boss. The only interesting ones being the mini-bosses, as they're kind of like these mini-challenge battles, as they'll restrict stuff like certain party members or items, and if you don't beat them quick enough, they'll just instantly wipe your party and you'll have to go back to your last save. However, the reward for all of these things is usually just a mildly useful item. The other type of side quest is ones given to you by Madame Ginkgo. Side note, it's kind of funny that the best trans rep that Atlus has put out is from fucking 1995, whose quests all have a sort of 3-act structure over the course of the game. These are a little bit more substantial than the Ion directives, as they actually have some sort of small story behind each one, be it something like a ordinary civilian pining after a devil summoner, or a washed up, tired detective eager to pin blame on Ringo and just call it a day. The problem is that they all involve just exploring places you've already been or you're about to go, and there's not really any substance to these side quests, both in terms of the actual content in them and the story that's behind them. Luckily, some of them do have better rewards, like lower prices or different items in shops, but that's about it. The final thing I really want to talk about is the game's presentation, because there's a lot of neat little things in here. Something I've been begging Atlus to do is to use those 3D models they created for the demons in Persona 5 for just more games, and that's something they've slowly but surely started to be doing. Reusing them once again for Persona 5 Strikers, and then SMT5, and now Soul Hackers 2. Inexpensive game development resulting in more games with shorter development times aside, I think that these models are really great and hold up really well. What I especially like is how with just a few texture adjustments, a lighting rework, and different shading, it means each game can give a completely different feel. Persona 5 had its mild cel-shaded look, and SMT5 had this very shiny, more detailed, higher this man Nintendo lighting. But Soul Hackers 2 really went the extra mile to try and look different by making these character models look a lot more unique despite the fact that they're still using the same base assets. In a very similar way to how Raido 2 does it, funnily enough, which is honestly quite fitting. The significantly more cel-shaded look, as well as the sort of semi-transparent decal overlay to all of the textures, gives them a lot more, well, texture, and there's definitely some winners and some losers with this new aesthetic, but what it does is really competently recreate the 2D art style from all of the concept and key art. And I think that sets the game's look apart from its two contemporaries quite nicely. And while we're talking about the 2D character art, something that I think is really obvious now in hindsight, but seems like a really good way of improving the presentation, is what they've done with the dynamic faces on the static character portraits. Not only do they have two portraits on screen at a time, so the listener can have some sort of a response to whoever's speaking, but character portraits also change mid-sentence now too, which honestly allows for much more dynamic character expression in the rigid structure of cutscene that this style creates. And this expression is even something that extends to the character models too. While it's not necessarily on the same levels as the Catherine engine, after all that engine was specifically designed for this sort of thing, the facial expressions in Soul Hackers 2 do capture the art style really well, even outside the game's more expensive custom animated cutscenes, which is honestly more than what Persona does half the time. Finally, while dungeons are certainly barren, the same can't be said for the city hubs that are very detailed in comparison, and a lot more visually interesting even if they are quite small. This is clearly just a carryover of the exact same style that they had in Tokyo Mirage Sessions, but considering everything else, from the reused demon models to the simple dungeon design to the lower overall budget to Atlus's willingness to do something weird and different, these city areas actually remind me more of stuff like Iwatodai, Inaba, and the Junkyard from Personas 3, 4, and Digital Devil Saga. And this is where we finally bring ourselves to this video's thumbnail and subtitle. That is to say, Soul Hackers 2 looks and feels just like a PS2 game. Not in a low poly, muddy textures, basic lighting kind of way, the game is actually very clean and sharp in its look, especially when it's on next gen. But everything about its design, its gameplay, its budget feels like we've returned to that PS2 era of Atlus. And when I say Soul Hackers 2 looks like a PS2 game, I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Soul Hackers 2 has obviously had a wide range of reviews from critics and fans alike, since it's not going to be Atlus's next big Persona or mainline sequel slash successor slash killer, or whatever they were kind of expecting it to be. And if you go in with that expectation, you're probably going to walk out a little bit burnt. But Soul Hackers 2 is a game for the fans of Mega 10 and Persona as a whole. It's a game to tide us over, to sate our tastes for little gremlins that call us a hoe. It's for the people who, in the gap between P5 and SMT5's releases, downloaded the Devil Summoner games because they loved Persona and this is what their friends recommended to them. It's for the people who say, yo, guys, you don't get it. Margin Tensei 2 Spiral Nemesis's OST is peak, easy S tier. And ultimately, it's for people who just want something a little bit new and different from what we've received in the last decade. And I think that's pretty cool. Hey everyone, if you're still here, thank you for watching the video till the end. Just a few quick things. I'd like to thank Atlus and Sega for providing a review code for this game. I was absolutely ecstatic to receive it. The original Soul Hackers being one of the first games that I reviewed on this channel, and the first game that I reviewed in the Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei series, means that it's got a very near and dear place in my heart, so I was absolutely overjoyed that I was able to get a code for the sequel. And since we were hearing things like they wanted to make Devil Summoner or Soul Hackers the sort of third pillar to the Mega 10 franchise, next to Mainline and Persona, I really hope that we end up seeing more sequels for this series in the future. Next SMT game we will be playing will most definitely be Raido 2. I'll probably get to that next year at some point, because we've got a lot of Trails videos that I want to do coming up, and I also really want to get Before Crisis done before the Crisis Core remake comes out, so keep an eye out for those things in the future. And sorry there won't be Mega 10 content for around about 6 months now. SMT5 definitely burnt me out pretty bad, and while I do think I've recovered quite a bit from that, I definitely don't want to push that and see how long it will take for me to burn out again, so we'll be shifting gears for a couple of months at least.